Welcome back to the Root and Branch Synod, and right now we have an exciting speaker who will be very familiar to some of you, Tina Beattie, who is going to speak to us on, I love the title of your talk, it's Catalytic Conversions, Transforming the Church's Gender Politics Beyond Add Women and Stir. But before you launch into that, let me just give a little bit more introduction about you, and I hope it won't take the entire time of your talk. Tina Beattie, as well as being the Professor Emerita of Catholic Studies at the University of Roehampton in England, is a familiar voice on Thought for the Day on BBC Radio 4. She's also the director of the Catherine of Siena College, also at the University of Roehampton, which offers online courses in theology, gender, and social justice. And not only does Tina write academic publications, but she's launched a new career as a novelist. And her first novel was called The Good Priest. And the second one is just coming out, titled Between Two Rivers. And we look forward to that. And Tina has such wide range of interests that take in not only her academic work, but all about mysticism, gender, psychoanalytic theories of desire. That sounds worth a lecture in itself. Marian theology and devotion, art theology, and also women's sexual and reproductive health and rights. Back to rights again. So without further ado, Tina Beattie.
Thank you. Being in this gathering takes me back to when we first arrived from Zimbabwe in 1988 with 4 very small children. And some of the people here, I won't say old friends because you all look as new as the day I met you, but some of the people here were among the very, very first to welcome us to the UK at a time which was a time of quite traumatic adjustment for me. I was a brand new Catholic. We'd left my beloved Africa where I'd grown up, and it took some time to adjust and adapt. So I just can't tell you how lovely it is to be here with you today. Some might say cataclysmic conversions rather than catalytic conversions. And certainly we're going to stir by adding women. But I wanted to give the idea that when women ask to be more fully included and represented, it's not just about adding those who will keep everything in place. It's about a daring and radical transformation. I would almost want to say transubstantiation because that evokes the idea of a catalyst. If we only bring women in who will already support the systems and structures, I think let's not bother. Women can be clerical, as Pope Francis keeps on reminding us. Women can get things wrong. That's no reason for keeping women out. But I think we must be careful what we're asking for and careful what we credit women with being able to do. So it's a venture that will take all of us responding to Pope Francis's call to a radical, bold, risk-taking venture to the far horizons where God beckons to us but always recedes just ahead of where we are so that there's no end to the adventure of this pilgrimage, even if we often find ourselves stumbling through blind alleys and meeting obstacles we'd never anticipated. I'm using PowerPoint just as a prompt to me, actually, and I've got a lot of quotations from Pope Francis which just remind me what I want to say, but also because that question earlier, what good does the Vatican do? And I think a lot of us want to say not a lot. But actually, as a convert from Presbyterianism, I do remember Mervyn Davies, some of you will remember Mervyn very well, saying to me once, you know, the problem, and at the church I was in as a Presbyterian was very evangelical, and he said the problem with evangelical churches can be that everyone who can read the Bible is an infallible authority. At least we only have one. We know where it sits and we know the limits of its power. And I have to say, paradoxically, even as someone who never expected from being a member of an evangelical group called Homemakers with my 4 little children, the idea that I would one day, I left school at 15 as well, the idea that I would one day be a professor of feminist theology who was banned by the CDF would have been the most remote possibility on my far horizons where God beckons. But I do think it's important that we have a hierarchy. Everything is hierarchical. It depends. Any institution needs to be hierarchical to some extent. It's what kind of hierarchy it is. It's transparency, it's accountability. But also, one of the great delights still for me in doing Catholic theology is the coherence, is the body of wisdom and teachings that do join up under the surface, no matter how turbulent and cracked the surface gets. And in my time as a Catholic, it's been all but shattered because, you know, we've had 2 very authoritarian papacies. And one of the reasons I'm talking quite a lot about Pope Francis as well is because I do believe this is a watershed. I don't think he has taken the kind of radical moves with regard to women that would allow his vision to be securely embedded in the Church of the future. But I do think that who comes after him is going to be crucial for our generation and the one to come. They will either build on what he does in more radical ways, and he is paving the way in his reform of the Curia for that to happen, but we must trust the Holy Spirit to keep him on this earth long enough to make that happen. Otherwise, I fear we could find we're in for a reactionary phase. So I'm saying quite a lot that's critical of Pope Francis today, but I'm saying it in the context of respectful criticism and affectionate criticism. And I just want to, can we change the slide? I just want to start by pointing out that he is on a learning curve with women, I think. Early in his papacy, he said some truly awful things like women theologians are the strawberries on the fruitcake. Well, I've got my strawberry-coloured boots on, but I am sometimes tempted to trample over the Vatican cake, but never mind. But as time goes on, I think he is becoming more and more aware of the importance of women's voices. He could have done far more. For example, in his encyclicals and his official teaching documents, not a single woman appears in any of the footnotes. It would have been a very painless way to give women some teaching authority, just to quote a few in some of his writings. But in his latest book, Let Us Dream, which is interviews he did with Austen Ivory, there are some really interesting things about women, the response of women politicians to the pandemic, the need to recognise that women may be the people who need to lead us into the new post-COVID world. He's a great fan of the alternative economics offered by people, I've got their names here, like Kate Raworth and Mariana Mazzucato. He talks about maternal economies. So I think that he is paving the way for women to have a greater voice. I don't think he holds theologians generally in much respect, but I do regret that so far women are allowed to deal with mammon but not with God. But we are on a learning curve. And the next slide, I think one of the things we most urgently need is to follow Pope Francis's model of dialogue. Dialogue is a word that occurs more often than many others in his writings. It's a deeply important and deeply intellectually well-formed understanding he has, a lot of it is informed by the former Jesuit and literary critic Michel de Certeau, but I don't think Pope Francis is interested in impressing his theological peers with his learning. I think he'd far rather use images and stories that appeal to ordinary people. So when people say he's not an intellectual, I think they're just showing their snobbery. But this understanding of dialogue is intended for married couples in Amoris Laetitia, but the Vatican, the Catholic hierarchy, the synods of bishops need to take every word of this dialogue on board and get going in dialogue with women, and that, I believe, is the key to transformation, not just the hand-picked dutiful handmaids who will come into the Rome echo chamber and say what they want to hear, but women who represent the vast diversity of cultures and contexts and incarnational life around the world. And my lovely friend Virginia Saldana is one of the stars. You've also heard from Nontando Hadebi, another dear friend, who, you know, there are women all over the world with great passion and eloquence. And this model of dialogue would allow those voices to begin to shape the church of the future. Now, in the little time left to me, I'm just going to briefly touch on 3 areas where I think women can and must be catalysts for change, not replacing, not shouting down what's there already, but entering into it in partnership with all who share the vision, men, women, and everyone in between. And I think the 3 areas we need to look at are sacramentality, ethics, and anthropology. So the next slide. Pope Francis has not contributed anything to the theology of gender and priesthood, except to repeat that Pope John Paul II decisively answered the question, the church has no authority to ordain women. But a couple of times he's been pushed by journalists to support this claim. And I just love the answer he gives. I use this often, some of you will have heard it before. So we go back to Hans Urs von Balthasar's suprasexual ecclesiology with brides and bridegrooms all over the place. And no wonder we have a sex abuse scandal, really. If this is what they're teaching young guys in seminaries, I know how they ought to spell seminaries. Sorry, don't take that off the YouTube recording. So we have this nuptial ecclesiology. We have woman variously representing bride, mother, the feminine, the woman. These terms aren't interchangeable. You know, we're not all this kind of womb that's stuck in the middle of the world to hold men's fantasies. I could go on, but what also amuses me about this is that he says it's la Chiesa, it's not il Chiesa. The church is a woman, the church is feminine. Well, sorry, Pope John Paul II, who did more than any other with his theology of the body to promote this rather ghastly. I like nuptial theology, all right, but I think we need to go back to the days when the symbolism of marriage was about more than sex. In fact, anyone who's been married for any length of time knows that that's the last thing on your mind. So let's just, you know, when we talk about Christ and the church, we're not talking about suprasexual or any other kind of bonking. But in Pope John Paul II's mother tongue, churches, Kościoł, it's a masculine noun in Polish. So I'm highly amused that Pope Francis thinks that because in Italian it's feminine, the church must be a woman. Some grammar lessons are needed there. But then we go on to Evangelium Gaudium. I think he has a sense of humour. I think if I could get in a room with him and just say, you know, this is a bit bonkers, Pope Francis, we could probably drink a bottle of wine and laugh together. But I love this from Evangelii Gaudium. The church preaches in the same way that a mother speaks to their child. Our mother culture, our native language. I'm not reading these word for word. They're all in the documents. But then he goes on to say, I'm just getting a slightly bigger version, this enculturated preaching requires a synthesis that comes from the passionate heart of the preacher, rather than ideas or detached values. Hold on a minute. Women are not allowed to preach the homily because of this detached idea that the female body, if blokes look at her, they don't see the image of Christ on the altar. That is in Inter Insignores. Christ was and remains a man. It would be hard to see the image of Christ in the priest if it was a woman. Well, that tells you all you need to know about the lens through which men in the CDF view female bodies. Lambs, rocks, eagles, you name it, but we don't see Christ when we look at a woman. But so sorry, this mother's voice is not a detached idea or an abstract reality. Well, sorry, but look at the only person allowed to use that voice. It's a ventriloquist's voice. It's not a woman's voice. It's not a mother's voice. So we need to break open the symbolism. These are rich symbols. They're beautiful. They're part of our tradition, the poetics of our faith, the sacramentality of our vision. The language matters, but it's become glued to a kind of biological essentialism, which just makes us look a bit ridiculous when we begin to look at the way this language is functioning, while at the same time getting endless outpourings of gender ideology. And, you know, men are, from the book of Genesis onwards, destined to be one thing and women are another, and there's nothing in between. And then we get this sort of symbolic. So we need to reclaim our tradition, but in a way that includes women as incarnate presences in the task of living sacramental representation and interpretation. The next slide I'm just going to skip over in the interests of time, but it's another one on the ecclesiology of woman. You know, Pope Francis, I love his ideas of a sort of dialectics that runs through everything. And one of them, he says, is time is greater than space. And the idea is that our modern worldview crams everything into space. A politician sets out a manifesto, delivers on it, well, sorry, used to deliver on it. Now, yeah, well, that's for another time. But, you know, his argument is that what we don't allow is time for mistakes, time for growth, time for discernment, patience, allowing things to mature. But when I read what he says about woman, mother, church, woman is the space of man's becoming. Man occupies time, in Pope Francis's thought, woman occupies space, or woman is the space. She's the womb, she's the unchanging receptacle. Everything he says about enculturation stops when he gets to women. Motherhood is enculturated, women are enculturated. There's no one thing that we can trace back to Genesis 1 to 3 and say, that's God's blueprint. It's just not like that. So, you know, I question what underlying fears there are, what underlying inhibitions there are that are preventing these things being recognised, because they're so obvious. But moving on, and again, I'm going to be very brief, bodily ethics, the ethics of sacramentality, the ethics of church life. If the church is a mother, what does it mean? Now, again, I think the qualities attributed to this idealised maternal life, nurture, patience, bringing up the weakest child as well as the strongest, it's wonderful. Somebody put on Twitter yesterday that she wanted to throw the baby books out of the window because her baby hadn't read them. And I said, well, I went one better. I once threw one of them at the baby. Women can sin. Women are real human beings with all the fallibility and failure. And rarely do we become so aware of that as when we are mothering little children. As a grandmother, I look at these little lovely children and think, did I ever stand in the middle of the living room floor and screech like a banshee at one of these little people? And then at 11 o'clock at night, Grandma, I need to do a poo. I think, oh yeah, I did, and I want to do it again. So being a mother is like anything else we humans do. It's difficult, and that shouldn't take away from a maternal ethics and ecclesiology, but we need to be able to talk about the realities of ethical life for ordinary people and to recognise that our sacramentality and symbolism are ideals, aspirations, promises, but they mustn't be imposed upon us here and now. So, and also in Laudato Si, we have this sort of little excursus, which is the only time women are mentioned in Laudato Si, on what it means to be a body. Well, sorry guys, you know, a bunch of celibate men sitting in Rome can't really tell women what it means to be a female body. So, yeah, we have a problem. Moving on, I'm just aware of time and I'm fitting a lot in. Laudato Si doesn't mention women, but it's gendered through and through because it is about Mother Earth. But Mother Earth is represented in such a way that she's a bit like the ideal woman. She's wounded, she's vulnerable, she's a victim, and she's waiting for knights in papal armour to come along and rescue her. Well, guys, we don't need rescuing. Mother Earth aborts her children. That's what COVID is. That's what hurricanes and floods and fires and global warming and the climate crisis are about. We are disposable. If we get in the way of life itself, Mother Earth will make the kind of hard decisions that sometimes ordinary human mothers have to make. Which child do you privilege? The born ones that you have responsibility to, or the microscopic zygote that you didn't intend? I'm not going down that road, and it's much more complex than pro-life, pro-choice. But what I do want to say is that if we want a serious environmental theology, Laudato Si is a glorious encyclical. I just think it's marvellous to read, but it lacks an absolutely vital dimension, which is the contribution women make and the ideas that ecofeminists have been working on for 50 years about the relationship, since Rachel Carson's Silent Spring was 1961. Pope Francis, none of his advisors have said, hey, women have written on this, you might like to read their books. I asked one of the guys who advised him on Laudato Si, where are the women? He said, we can't do everything at once. So just moving on, I've just put up a slide which just shows maternal mortality rates. Nearly 300,000 women die every year from causes relating to childbirth and pregnancy. 99% of these are in the world's poorest communities, both within rich countries and, of course, in the global south. So we're a poor church that smells of the poor, that smells of the sheep. We get into the ditch, we get our hands dirty, we're messy. You will search in vain in any social teaching document for an acknowledgement of this. It's just not there. Nearly 300,000 dead women a year are not there. And that's a lot worse. COVID is exacerbating all these problems. And just the next slide is just the Sustainable Development Goals put women centre stage. If there is no gender justice, there's no environmental justice. So Laudato Si has a glaring omission, and until it gets more realistic about these things, I fear it's not going to serve us well. Next, and finally, anthropology. The church needs a good theological anthropology, but it doesn't have one, because you cannot have an anthropology with half the human race not thinking the other half has a voice, but thinking they know exactly what the other half signifies, what it needs, and how to rule over it. And in Laudato Si, Pope Francis says what feminist theologies have been saying again for 40 or 50 years about the Promethean spirit, the mastery of the world that has infected Christian anthropology. We have, in a sense, lorded it over nature, our sister Earth, our Mother Earth. I think man has gone too far. You don't say. And the next little paragraph on the next slide, I just pick out this paragraph from Populorum Progressio. Laudato Si is a biopolitical encyclical. Populorum Progressio was a geopolitical encyclical. One is about the world divided up into nation states and laws. It has nothing to say on the environment, and it has a very Promethean vision of the human in relation to the geopolitical world. Laudato Si has what I would call a feminist vision of getting rid of the anthropocentrism, getting rid of the tyranny of technocracy. But it's all the more tragic in a way that all it lacks is that dialogue with women that would say, together we are going forward, together as equals, as disciples, into the future we need to articulate together. And the next slide is just another point that is in Laudato Si, which is a critique of individualism. And again, that is so important. But in all honesty, very few women can be infected by individualism because women are still caregivers, nurturers, responsible, particularly again during the pandemic when domestic violence has soared, mental health issues have soared, and parents, it's not just women, I know that. My own son has had, close to a nervous breakdown through the stresses of the pandemic, but the vast majority of women have borne the brunt of children confined at home, no help, no support, no childcare. So individualism is a luxury that I don't think women have really been able to afford in any great measure. And again, it's why we need a more subtle anthropology in order to articulate the vision of what it means to be human in a world that threatens us as never before. And finally, just moving on, I love this paragraph from Laudato Si. An authentic humanity calling for a new synthesis seems to dwell in the midst of our technological culture, almost unnoticed, like a mist seeping gently beneath a closed door. Will the promise last in spite of everything, with all that is authentic rising up in stubborn resistance? That authentic humanity calls to us. It calls to us from the very heart of creation. And we cannot articulate a response as the church unless we show that we have an authentic humanity which recognises the full and equal dignity and humanity of all her members. And the vision I have of the church, next slide, today is of this crumbling ruin with something very beautiful growing up in the ruined spaces. But where are the women? And finally, it's not just women's voices that we silence when we silence half of humanity. It's also the other voice of God. I love these two consecutive verses from Isaiah. The prophet speaks in the third person. Yahweh advances like a hero. His fury is stirred like a warrior's. He gives the war shout, raises the hue and cry, marches valiantly against his foes. That's how the men of God see God, the warrior. And then God speaks. From the beginning, I have been silent. I have kept quiet, held myself in check. I groan like a woman in labour. I suffocate, I stifle. Who are we not listening to when we don't listen to women? Thank you.
I think that was absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much, Tina. As ever, you always give so much to think about and open doors and windows and wonderful sort of visions of what we can be thinking about, and of course the depth behind these incredible writings, and also revealing their flaws and where they're coming from. Thank you so much. Keep on doing what you're doing. We need you.
Thank you.
Thank you.